My wife grabbed a microphone at our baby shower and told 70 guests I wasn't the father. I walked out and made one call. Her father went white as a sheet, ran to her, and whispered something that made her smile disappear forever. She had no idea what she just activated. My name is Elia Hargrove. I'm 44 years old. I own a small company that repairs and resells commercial equipment, the kind of machines that keep diners and distribution centers running. I built it from nothing, just a rented garage and a used truck, and over 12 years I turned it into something worth being proud of. I have a son named Owen. He's 8, gap-toothed, obsessed with dinosaurs, and the single best thing I've ever been part of. And until that Saturday afternoon in March, I believed I had a second child on the way. The baby shower was Natalie's idea from the start. 70 guests, a rented hall in Riverside, pastel balloons, and a catered spread that cost more than my first truck. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, 75 years old, founder of a regional property trust that had been in his family since the 80s, was seated at the head table like he always was, back straight, bourbon in hand, watching everything with those flat boardroom eyes. Owen had been bouncing off the walls all morning. He pulled at my sleeve before we left the house and said, "Dad, do you think it's going to be a boy or a girl?" I told him I didn't know. He said he didn't care, as long as the baby liked dinosaurs. I laughed. That laugh feels like it belonged to a different man now. The room was full and loud when Natalie took the microphone. I was standing near the back, talking to a supplier I hadn't seen in a year, when the noise faded. Natalie had that look on her face, the one she wore when she'd already decided something and won an audience for it. She raised her glass, smiled at the room, and then turned her eyes directly to me. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth," she said, her voice bright and clear and utterly calm. "Elliot isn't the father." The room didn't gasp. It just stopped. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Someone's fork hit a plate. I stood there holding a glass of sparkling water, completely still, while 69 people stared at me. I didn't shout. I didn't move toward her. I set the glass down on the nearest table, buttoned my jacket, and walked outside. The parking lot was warm and quiet. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to one contact, and pressed call. 2 rings. "It's time," I said. "Initiate everything we discussed." Behind me, through the glass doors, I could see Gerald Whitmore rising from his chair. He crossed the room in a straight line, jaw set, and grabbed Natalie by the arm. He leaned close to her ear, and even from outside I could read the shape of what he was saying and the way her face changed, going from triumphant to pale in about 3 seconds flat. I found out later exactly what he told her. A friend who was standing close enough heard every word. Gerald said, "Do you have any idea what you just did? Start begging him to come back inside. Right now, or you're going to lose absolutely everything." She didn't move fast enough. Neither did he. I was already on my way to my attorney's office. People always assumed Gerald Whitmore married his daughter off to me because I was useful. They weren't entirely wrong. But the full story is more complicated than that. And if you want to understand why one phone call in a parking lot could unravel a decades-old family empire, you need to understand how it was built and who Gerald trusted to hold it together. I met Natalie at a trade show in Phoenix 11 years ago. She was walking the floor with her father, learning the business, or pretending to. I was there trying to sell refurbished commercial freezer units to restaurant chains. Gerald cornered me in my booth, looked at my spec sheets for about 45 seconds, and said, "You actually know what you're doing." Coming from him, that was practically a marriage proposal. Natalie and I got serious within the year. Gerald warmed up slowly, the way cold engines do, reluctantly, and only under pressure. But by the time we married, something had shifted between us. He'd seen me handle a contract dispute, watched me turn a failing equipment deal into a profitable resale, and somewhere along the way he stopped testing me and started talking to me like a partner. Owen came along 3 years into the marriage. Gerald held him in the hospital room with the careful stiffness of a man who'd never quite learned tenderness, and I saw something move behind his eyes that I hadn't seen before. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. 2 years after that, Gerald called me into his home office, a room that smelled like old wood and bourbon and decisions, and laid it all out. His sons, Natalie's 2 brothers, had proven themselves spectacularly unreliable. One had burned through a property development fund, chasing a resort concept in New Mexico that never broke ground. The other had spent the better part of a year consulting for a startup that turned out to be a vanity project for a college roommate. Gerald was 73 by then, and he was done pretending his bloodline was going to protect his legacy. "I need someone who reads a balance sheet the way a mechanic reads an engine," he told me, pouring 2 glasses without asking. "That's you. Not my boys. You." What he handed me wasn't just a title. It was operational control of the Whitmore Family Trust, real estate holdings across 3 states, a commercial property portfolio, 2 private foundations, and a set of governing documents thick enough to stop a door. Buried inside those documents, on a page most people would never reach, was a clause his attorney had drafted years earlier after a quiet family scandal. A morality clause, the kind that gave the acting trustee, me, full authority to freeze distributions and assets if any named beneficiary engaged in conduct deemed publicly damaging to the family's reputation. Gerald never mentioned it directly. I found it myself during my first full read-through. I flagged in the margin, filed it away, and didn't think about it again for years. Until I needed it. The week before the baby shower, something shifted. Natalie was distracted in a way that had edges to it. Not the soft distraction of pregnancy fatigue, but something sharper, like she was rehearsing something in her head. She snapped at Owen twice over nothing. She took a call in the backyard and stayed out there 20 minutes past dark. I didn't confront her. I just watched, and I made a quiet call to my attorney, a man named Robert Calloway, who'd been handling my business contracts for 6 years. If something happens, I told him, I want to be ready to move within the hour. He didn't ask what kind of something. He just said, I'll have everything staged. Owen asked me that Friday night if the new baby could share his dinosaur books. I told him absolutely. He went to bed satisfied. I went to bed knowing the following afternoon was going to change everything. I just didn't know yet how far the damage would reach. Robert Calloway's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. I'd been sitting across from his desk for about 20 minutes when my phone started going off. Natalie. 4 times in a row. Then Gerald. Then Natalie again. I turned the phone face down and kept talking. Robert was the kind of attorney who never looked surprised. He had a yellow legal pad in front of him and a pen he kept clicking without seeming to notice. I laid out everything. The clause, the documentation I'd already pulled together over the previous 3 weeks, the nature of the public incident. He listened without interrupting, made 6 lines of notes, and then said, You understand this is going to move fast once we file. I told him that was exactly what I wanted. By the time I got home that evening, Natalie's car was in the driveway, and every light in the house was on. Owen was at my mother's. I'd arranged that the morning of the shower, just in case. I walked in through the garage, set my keys on the counter, and poured a glass of water. Natalie came down the stairs like she was expecting a fight. She had that look, jaw forward, eyes sharp, shoulders set. She'd changed out of the shower dress into jeans and a sweater, which somehow made the whole thing feel more deliberate. You need to stop whatever you started, she said. Call Robert and tell him to stand down. I drank some water. No, Elliot. Her voice had that particular edge she used when she thought volume alone could move me. This is insane. You're going to blow up our entire family over one moment. You blew it up, I said. I'm just filing the paperwork. She crossed her arms. My father will reverse it. He'll call the board and have your access revoked before the week is out. I set the glass down and looked at her directly. Natalie, your father made me executive with full, irrevocable authority. His words, his attorney, his signature. He can call whoever he wants. The clause is already triggered. The freeze is already in motion. And there is nothing in that document that allows him to override my decision unilaterally. You might want to read page 47 of the charter before you make any more promises about what he can fix. The certainty in her face flickered. Just for a second. This is about more than today. I continued. You've been pulling away for 8 months. You stopped talking to me like a partner. You started managing me like a problem. And now you stood up in front of 69 people and told them our baby isn't mine. That isn't a moment. That's a conclusion. You're being dramatic, she said, but her voice had less steel in it now. I'm being accurate, I replied. There's a difference. She tried 3 more angles over the next 40 minutes. She said I was punishing Owen. I told her Owen was protected. His trust allocation was structured separately, and I hadn't touched it. She said I was humiliating her. I said she'd handled that herself. She said her father would tell the board I'd acted in bad faith. I told her to have him try, and reminded her that the compliance committee included two of Gerald's most conservative cousins, neither of whom had forgotten the New Mexico resort disaster. That one landed. She sat down on the couch and went quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, the anger was gone and something smaller had replaced it. What do you want from me, Elliot? Right now. I picked up my keys. Nothing. I'm going to get Owen from my mother's. He wants to come home, and this house still belongs to him regardless of what happens between us. I drove to my mother's house in Riverside, and Owen ran to the door in his socks and threw his arms around my waist without asking a single question about where I'd been. I held on to that for a long moment. Some things don't need documents. They just need to still be standing. The DNA kit sat in my desk drawer for 11 days before I used it. I'd ordered it the morning after the shower. Same day I met with Robert, while my phone was still face down on his desk. It wasn't impulsive. It was the question I'd been refusing to ask out loud for months, and once Natalie had answered the public version of it in front of 69 witnesses, I figured I owed myself the private version too. Owen didn't know anything was happening. He went to school, came home, ate cereal for breakfast, and argued about bedtime, and built increasingly ambitious dinosaur habitats out of cardboard boxes in the hallway. I watched him and tried not to do the math on his features. Try not to notice the way he squinted when he concentrated, the same way I do. Try not to notice, and noticed anyway. I swabbed the kid on a Tuesday evening while he was asleep. Sent it off Wednesday morning on my way to the shop. Went back to work, 2 industrial refrigeration units in for overhaul, a commercial oven needing a full control board swap, and kept my hands busy while my head ran laps. The results came back on a Thursday, 11 days later. I was sitting at my workbench when the email notification hit my phone. I put down the socket wrench, wiped my hands on a shop rag, and opened it. Owen James Hargrove. Probability of paternity, 99.98%. I read it twice. Then I set the phone down on the bench and sat very still for about 2 minutes. He was mine. Completely, mathematically, unambiguously mine. I don't know exactly what I've been bracing for. I told myself I was prepared for either result. But sitting there in my shop with grease on my forearms and that number on my screen, something I hadn't realized I was holding released all at once. And I had to put both hands flat on the workbench to keep from doing something embarrassing. He was mine. That evening I picked Owen up from school and took him to get burgers. His choice, always the same place. Always a double cheeseburger with no pickles. We sat in a booth by the window, and he talked about a project his class was doing on volcanoes, and whether volcanoes were more dangerous than asteroids, and what would happen if a volcano erupted inside a city. I listened to every word. At one point, he looked up from his food and said, "Dad, are you and Mom going to stop living together?" Kids don't ease into things. I've always admired that about them. Things are going to change, I told him honestly, but I'm not going anywhere. Not from you. That part stays the same no matter what. He thought about this for a moment, chewing. Then he said, "Okay, can I get milkshake?" I told him he could get 2 if he wanted. He settled for 1, chocolate, and went back to volcanoes. That night, after he was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a copy of the trust documents and Robert's latest update. The freeze was holding. Gerald had contacted the compliance board twice and been referred to the charter both times. Natalie's informal legal inquiry had gone nowhere. The machinery was turning exactly as designed. But none of that was what I was thinking about. I was thinking about a 9-year-old boy asking a fair question over a double cheeseburger and getting a straight answer, and deciding a milkshake was the right response. That kid had his priorities in order. I was going to make sure I kept mine the same way. Robert Calloway didn't recommend hiring a private investigator. He said it wasn't legally necessary. The public incident alone was sufficient to sustain the clause. But he also said, and I remember his exact words, "If you want to know the full shape of what you're dealing with, that's a different kind of preparation." He slid a business card across the desk without making it a suggestion. Just information. I called the number that evening. The investigator's name was Frank Delner, mid-50s, former insurance fraud examiner, no social media presence, which I took as a good sign. We met at a diner near my shop the following Tuesday. He drank black coffee, asked 8 direct questions, and charged a flat rate. I hired him on the spot. He came back to me in 9 days. I was at the shop when he called, halfway through rewiring a commercial dishwasher control panel. I told my technician to finish the job and took the call in my office, a small room off the main floor with a window that looked out over the equipment yard. Frank's report was precise. The man's name was Troy Bancroft, 40 years old. He worked as a regional sales director for a commercial kitchen supply company, the same industry I operated in, which explained how paths had crossed. He and Natalie had apparently met at an industry networking event 14 months ago. Frank had photographs, time-stamped, from 3 separate locations: a restaurant in Pasadena, a hotel parking structure in Burbank, a coffee shop 2 blocks from Owen's school. That last one sat in my chest like a hot coal. There was more. Troy Bancroft had no idea Natalie was pregnant. Frank had confirmed this through a source inside Troy's workplace, an assistant who'd overheard a phone conversation in which Troy expressed, with some agitation, that he'd just learned about the baby shower announcement through mutual industry contacts and had no prior knowledge of Natalie's pregnancy. He was, by all accounts, blindsided. So she'd been using him without telling him. And she'd been using me as the financial floor she planned to land on. I sat with that for a long time after I hung up. The following afternoon, Natalie's brother showed up at my shop unannounced. Both of them, Derek and Paul Whitmore, mid-40s, tans they couldn't afford and attitudes calibrated for men with more leverage than they actually had. Derek did most of the talking. He stood in my equipment yard in a sport coat and told me I was making a mistake, that the family would come together to resolve this privately, that I should stand down and let Gerald handle it. I listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Are you done?" Derek blinked. "Elliot, I'm trying to. I have 2 cameras covering this yard," I said. "One at the gate, one on the south wall. Both recording with audio. Whatever you came here to say is now on file. So if either of you plans to follow this conversation with anything that looks like intimidation or interference, Robert Calloway will have the footage before you're back on the freeway." Paul, who hadn't said much, looked at the camera above the south door. He touched Derek's arm. They left. I forwarded the footage to Robert that evening. He filed it with the compliance record the next morning. Gerald called me 2 days later. He'd been calling Robert, who kept redirecting him to the charter, and apparently he'd finally decided to try me directly. The conversation was short. He opened with disappointment, moved quickly to pressure, and arrived at a thinly veiled suggestion that I was damaging the family's legacy for personal reasons. "Gerald," I said, "you gave me the authority to protect this trust from exactly this kind of reputational event. You wrote the clause. Your attorney drafted it. Your signature is on every page. If you'd like to argue that I'm misusing my authority, you're welcome to take that position to the compliance board. I'll see you there." He went quiet. Then, in a lower voice, he said, "She's my daughter." "I know," I said, "and Owen is my son. I have the paperwork to prove it." He didn't respond to that. The call ended shortly after. That night, I sat in Owen's doorway after he fell asleep and watched him breathe for a while. He was curled around a stuffed triceratops he'd had since he was 3, 1 foot hanging off the edge of the mattress. Completely peaceful, completely unaware. I thought about Troy Bancroft, who hadn't known about the pregnancy. I thought about Natalie, who'd planned the entire choreography of that shower with a precision that still impressed me in a grim sort of way. I thought about Gerald, who'd built an empire and handed the keys to the one person he trusted, and was now discovering what that actually meant. And then I stopped thinking about all of them and just watched my son sleep. Some problems you solve with documents. Some things you just have to protect. Robert called me on a Thursday morning with the kind of voice that means he's found something significant and is choosing his words carefully. "There's something in the trust review you need to see in person," he said. "Come in this afternoon." I rearranged 2 client appointments and was at his office by 2 o'clock. He had a printed summary on the desk and a spreadsheet open on his monitor. The trust compliance review, triggered by the clause activation, had involved a full audit of all accounts under the charter. Standard procedure. What wasn't standard was what the auditor had surfaced in the offshore account structure. Over a period of approximately 4 years, a series of transfers had moved funds from one of the Trust Delaware foundations into a private account in Gerald's name alone. The transfers were small individually, between $8,000 and $20,000 each, but there were 41 of them. The total was just under $900,000. I sat in the chair across from Robert and looked at the spreadsheet for a long time without speaking. "Is this tax evasion?" I asked. "That's for a forensic accountant to determine," Robert said carefully. What I can tell you is that these transfers were not authorized under the trust governing documents, and, as acting executive, you are required to flag and report them to the compliance board. I leaned back. Gerald did this himself. The account is in his name. The transfer authorizations carry his digital signature. The picture that assembled itself in my head was not a flattering one. Gerald had built the trust. He'd made himself the patriarch, the architect, the moral authority. He'd lectured his sons about fiscal responsibility while quietly moving $900,000 out of a foundation account and into his personal holdings. He'd handed me the keys to the vault, never imagining I'd look in the corners. "File it," I said. Robert paused. "Elliot, you understand that this implicates Gerald directly. It could trigger a tax authority review. It could affect his personal." "I understand," I said. "File it." He nodded and made a note. I drove back to the shop and sat in my office for 20 minutes before doing anything else. I wasn't angry at Gerald. I was something colder than angry. I was finished being surprised. The man who told me I was the only one he trusted had been running his own side account the entire time. Everyone in that family had an angle. The difference between them and me was that mine was in writing, authorized, and entirely above the table. I called Gerald that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me he'd been waiting. "The compliance audit found the Delaware transfers," I said. "I've instructed Robert to report them to the board." Silence. "Then, Elliot, those are private arrangements that predate your—" "They don't predate the charter," I said, "and they're not authorized under it. You know that." "I built that trust," he said, his voice dropping. "I built everything in it." "I know," I said. "Which means you knew exactly what the rules were when you broke them." Another silence. Longer this time. "What do you want?" he asked finally. Not demanding. Just tired. "I don't want anything from you, Gerald. I'm not using this as leverage. The rules require reporting, and I'm following the rules. The same rules you put in place. If you'd like to get ahead of this with the board yourself before the formal filing, you have about 48 hours. I hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot of my own shop, listening to the equipment hum through the walls. Compressors cycling. Fans running. The ordinary sound of things functioning as designed. I never wanted any of this. The trust, the authority, the audit, the confrontation with a 75-year-old man who thought he'd retirement-proofed himself by trusting the right son-in-law. I just wanted to run my business, raise my son, and go to bed without a stone in my chest. But here I was. And the job wasn't done yet. The family court filing landed on a Tuesday. Natalie's attorney, a man named Victor Prass, who specialized in high-asset divorce, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from winning enough cases to stop worrying about the ones he might lose, submitted an emergency motion claiming that my invocation of the trust clause constituted financial coercion and created an environment of emotional duress for a pregnant woman. He requested immediate restoration of Natalie's access to trust distributions and a temporary freeze on any further asset reviews. Robert Calloway had the response filed by Thursday afternoon. I sat in his office while he walked me through it. The counterfiling was precise and methodical. 41 pages that addressed every claim Prass had made, cited the specific charter language authorizing my actions, and attached, as exhibits, the video documentation of the baby shower incident, the compliance board's preliminary findings, and a certified copy of the trust governing documents, including the morality clause and its definition of reputational harm. "The emergency motion is a standard opening move," Robert said, leaning back in his chair. "He's trying to create urgency where there isn't any. The clause language is airtight. A family court judge isn't going to override a private trust's internal governance on the basis of emotional duress without substantial evidence of misconduct, and there is no misconduct here." The judge denied the motion within 48 hours. Standard operating procedure, inadequate basis for emergency relief. Prass refiled as a standard petition. Robert said we'd respond in the normal course, and not to lose sleep over it. I wasn't losing sleep over the legal process. I was losing sleep over Natalie's next move. It came on a Friday evening. I picked Owen up from school, and he was quiet in the back seat in a way that wasn't his usual quiet. Owen's silences are normally the kind that precede a question about dinosaur biology or whether black holes make noise. This one was different. He was looking out the window and holding his backpack in his lap like he was cold. "Mom called the school today," he said, "about 2 minutes from home." I kept my eyes on the road. What did she say? She told Mrs. Alderman that I should go home with Grandpa Gerald after school on Fridays from now on. He paused. Mrs. Alderman called you, right? She did, I said. Mrs. Alderman had called me at noon, and I'd already spoken to the school's administrative coordinator about authorizing pickups. My name was the primary contact. Gerald's was not. I told Mrs. Alderman I wanted to go home with you. Owen said. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. You did? Yeah. He shrugged with the particular casualness of an 8-year-old trying not to make a big deal out of something that was a big deal. I didn't want to go to Grandpa's without knowing if you knew. I pulled into our street and stopped at a light. Owen, you did exactly the right thing. And for the record, wherever you go after school, I will always know about it ahead of time. That's a guarantee. He nodded and seemed to settle. By the time we got home, he was asking about dinner. And by the time dinner was over, he was building something architectural with the cardboard boxes in the hallway. I called Robert that night and told him what had happened. He added it to the case file. The following week, he filed for primary physical custody, citing documented parental interference with established school protocols. He also cited Owen's expressed preference, which in California carried weight in family court proceedings once a child reached a certain level of demonstrated maturity. Victor Prass filed a counter-motion arguing that Natalie's pregnancy entitled her to primary residential consideration. The judge scheduled a hearing for 3 weeks out. Meanwhile, on a separate track, the Compliance Board completed its preliminary review of Gerald's unauthorized transfers. The board, chaired by Gerald's own cousin, a conservative retired banker named Arthur Felton, who had no patience for what he privately called family accounting creativity, issued a formal finding of unauthorized distribution. The matter was referred to the trust's forensic accountant and, per reporting requirements, flagged to the relevant tax authority for review. Gerald called me the night the finding was issued. It was almost 10 o'clock. He sounded older than he had 3 weeks ago, which I hadn't thought was possible. Arthur Felton called me this afternoon, he said. 22 years we've been in the same Sunday golf group. I know, I said. Was that necessary, Elliot? Flagging it to the tax people. It was required, I said. Charter, Schedule 7. Robert reported it because it's mandatory. I didn't have discretion, and neither did he. A long pause. I built that trust from nothing. 40 years. I know you did, I said. Which is why the rules you wrote for should apply to everyone, including you. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice had shifted into something that wasn't quite an apology, but was in the same neighborhood. I misjudged some things, he said. About Natalie. About what she was capable of. So did I said. For about 8 years. We left it there. Not warm. Not cold. Just two men who'd both been outmaneuvered by someone they trusted and were now dealing with the aftermath in different ways. The following Monday, Troy Bancroft filed a voluntary acknowledgement of paternity claim through a family law attorney in Pasadena. He'd apparently retained counsel the week before. Robert told me this was actually helpful. It meant the question of the unborn child's legal parentage would be resolved through proper channels without me being named in any contested proceedings. The biology was clear. The paperwork would follow. I wasn't named as the father. I wasn't going to fight to be. That chapter belonged to someone else. My chapter was Owen, and the hearing coming in 3 weeks. And the quiet, ordinary Tuesday morning when I dropped him at school and he turned around at the gate, gave me the same two-fingered wave he always gave, and disappeared through the doors without looking back. That wave was worth every document I'd filed. The relaunch event was held at a borrowed loft space in Culver City. I heard about it from Frank Delner, who'd stayed loosely connected to the case at my request. Natalie had organized what she was calling a community reception, an invitation-only gathering for her foundation supporters, board members, and a selection of media contacts she'd cultivated over the years. The stated purpose was to address recent misconceptions and reaffirm the foundation's commitment to its mission. Frank attended as a vendor contact of one of the catering companies. He sent me a 2-paragraph summary that evening. 41 people showed up. Of the 18 board members who'd received invitations, 6 came. The rest sent regrets or simply didn't respond. The event ran 90 minutes. Natalie gave a prepared statement about privacy, personal challenges, and the importance of context. There were no questions from the floor. The catering was described by Frank, with his characteristic understatement, as ambitious. 3 days later, The Haven Foundation's board voted to remove Natalie from her ambassador role. The letter was formal, brief, and cited conduct inconsistent with organizational values. A boutique wellness brand that had been in preliminary partnership discussions quietly informed her representation that they were pursuing other opportunities. A regional lifestyle publication that had been scheduled to feature her in a fall issue pulled the piece without explanation. Natalie's social media following had been approximately 44,000 before the shower. By the 6th week, it had dropped to 31,000, and the comments on her remaining posts had the particular tone of an audience that had decided to watch rather than engage. She filed a motion claiming her pregnancy, entitled her to expedited resolution of the custody matter, and requesting that the court consider her reduced financial circumstances, a direct result of the trust freeze, as a factor in determining support. Victor Prass argued it with conviction. Robert Calloway argued back with documentation. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named the Honorable Patricia Drummond, reviewed both filings and scheduled a formal hearing. At that hearing, 3 things happened that mattered. First, Owen's school counselor submitted a written statement describing Owen's expressed preference to remain his father's primary care, his stable academic performance, and his consistent emotional presentation during what the counselor described as a period of obvious family stress. Second, Judge Drummond declined to treat the trust freeze as a relevant factor in support calculation, noting that the freeze resulted from documented conduct by the petitioner, not from any action by the respondent that reduced available resources. Third, and most significantly, when Natalie's attorney argued that her pregnancy created special circumstances warranting residential priority, Judge Drummond asked a direct question. Who was the named father of the unborn child on the current legal record? Victor Prass answered that paternity was a separate matter pending resolution. Judge Drummond noted the answer in the record, allowed it to stand, and moved on. Natalie tried to use Owen twice more in the weeks that followed. The first time, she called him directly on his school tablet during lunch, a device that was supposed to be used only for schoolwork, and had a 20-minute conversation that Owen described to me that evening as weird and kind of sad. He said she'd asked him if he missed her. He told me he hadn't known what to say. I documented it and added it to Robert's file. The second time, she sent a message through Owen's weekend soccer coach, a volunteer named Keith who had no idea he was being used as a courier, asking Owen to tell me she wanted to talk. Owen came home from practice, relayed the message word for word with the matter-of-fact accuracy of a child who doesn't yet understand adult subtext, and then asked if he could have a popsicle. I gave him the popsicle and called Robert. Robert filed a motion citing documented attempts to use a minor child as an intermediary in adult legal proceedings. Judge Drummond added it to the record with a note that any further contact attempts routed through the child would be treated as interference with custody proceedings. Natalie went quiet after that. Not because she'd accepted anything, I suspected, but because Victor Prass had finally told her what Robert had been telling me from the start. The legal ground she was standing on was thin, and the more she moved on it, the further it gave way beneath her. The Haven Foundation board named a new ambassador, a former local news anchor who'd pivoted to wellness advocacy. The announcement was warmly received. Nobody mentioned Natalie by name. I had 3 weeks until the custody hearing. I spent them working, picking up Owen from school, helping him with his science project about tectonic plates, and eating cereal with him on Saturday mornings while he watched nature documentaries. Simple things. Real things. The kind that don't make headlines and don't require attorneys. The kind that hold. The custody hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a family court building in downtown Riverside that smelled like floor wax and recycled air. I arrived 20 minutes early with Robert Calloway, 2 folders of documentation, and the particular stillness that comes from knowing you've done everything you could do before walking through a door. Victor Prass was already there with Natalie when we arrived. She looked composed in the way people look composed when they've worked at it. Hair neat, expression neutral, hands folded on the table. I sat across the room and didn't stare. Judge Patricia Drummond ran a tight courtroom. She'd reviewed the filings in advance, which was clear from the way she moved through the proceedings without pausing to orient herself. She asked direct questions, accepted direct answers, and had the particular impatience of someone who'd been in family court long enough to recognize a manufactured argument from a genuine one. Victor Prass opened by reiterating Natalie's pregnancy and the emotional difficulty of the current circumstances. He argued that disrupting a child's relationship with his mother during this period would cause lasting harm. He was articulate and organized. It was a good argument for a weaker case. Robert responded with the documented record. Owen's school counselor's written statement. The incident with the school tablet. The soccer coach situation. The compliance board findings. The denial of both emergency motions. The paternity acknowledgement filed by Troy Bancroft. He presented everything in sequence, calmly, without theatrics. Judge Drummond asked Owen's counselor's statement to be read into the record. It was 3 paragraphs. The relevant part said, Owen has expressed, on multiple occasions and without prompting, a clear preference to remain in his father's care. He is emotionally stable, academically consistent, and demonstrates a secure attachment to his father that I would consider a primary protective factor during this transition period. Judge Drummond granted me primary physical custody of Owen. She established a structured visitation schedule for Natalie, 2 weekends per month and 1 midweek evening, with all exchanges to occur at a neutral location and all communication between parents to be conducted through a designated co-parenting app. She noted the previous attempts to use Owen as an intermediary and stated plainly that any recurrence would be treated as a violation of the parenting order. Natalie said nothing when the ruling was read. She kept her hands folded. Victor Prass wrote something on his legal pad. I thanked Robert in the parking lot. He said I'd done the work, and the outcome reflected it. We shook hands, and he drove away. I sat in my truck for a moment before starting the engine. Owen was at school. I was picking him up at 3:15, same as every Tuesday. He didn't know about the hearing. I was going to tell him simply, in the right words, that evening. The call came 12 days later. It was Gerald. Not his usual measured tone. Something thinner, more careful. He said Natalie had been admitted to Riverside University Health System the previous night. She'd gone into early labor at 34 weeks. There had been complications. The baby had been delivered by emergency procedure. The baby was alive. Small, in the NICU, but stable. Natalie was recovering. I sat with that for a long time. Gerald didn't ask me to do anything. He just told me, the way a man tells someone information he thinks they deserve to have regardless of the circumstances. Thank you for calling, I said. She made her choices, he said. So did I. But she's still my daughter. I know, I said. We ended the call without pretense. I went and picked up Owen from school, and on the way home I told him, carefully and simply, that his mother had been in the hospital but was okay. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if the baby was okay too. I told him the baby was small, but being looked after by good doctors. He nodded and looked out the window. After a minute he said, Dad, can we get a fish tank? I laughed. Actually laughed, the first real one in weeks, and told him we could look into it. Troy Bancroft visited the hospital the following day. Gerald told me that too, in a later conversation. He'd sat in the NICU and held his daughter for 20 minutes. Whether that amounted to anything going forward was between the two of them and whatever attorneys they'd eventually involve. That wasn't my story anymore. Mine was the kid asking about a fish tank. 8 months after the hearing, I bought a house on Clement Street in a quiet neighborhood in Corona. 3 bedrooms, a 2-car garage. I immediately converted into a workshop annex, a backyard with room for Owen to do whatever Owen was going to do next. I paid cash, not from the trust. Not a cent of it had ever touched my personal accounts, and I'd kept it that way on principle. For my own business, which had grown steadily over the past year in the way that businesses tend to grow when you stop spending your mental energy on things that can't be fixed and redirect it toward things that can. Owen chose his room on the first walkthrough. He stood in the doorway of the larger of the 2 secondary bedrooms, looked around for about 4 seconds, and said, "This one." He had a vision. I didn't ask questions. We spent a Saturday painting it. He decided on a deep forest green, an unusual choice for an 8-year-old, but Owen had always had definite opinions. I did the cutting in along the ceiling while he handled the roller on the main walls with the focused intensity he brought to anything he cared about. By the time we were done, the room smelled like paint and looked like a forest, and Owen stood in the middle of it with green specks on his forearms and said it was perfect. I started a new service line that fall. Preventive maintenance contracts for commercial kitchen equipment, bundled with the repair and resale work I'd been doing for years. It was the kind of steady, recurring revenue that stabilized a business through slow seasons. Within 4 months, I had 11 contracts. Within 7, I had 19. Gerald settled with the compliance board in the spring. The terms weren't public, but Robert told me they involved a significant repayment to the trust foundation accounts and a restructuring of his remaining personal involvement in trust affairs. He retained his family patriarch status and name. The operational authority stayed with me. He called me the day after the settlement was formalized. He said, "I owe you a conversation I should have had with Natalie 10 years ago." I told him it wasn't on him alone. He said maybe not. We agreed to disagree about the proportions. Natalie's visitation had settled into a workable rhythm. She showed up on her scheduled weekends, was present and appropriate with Owen, and communicated with me through the co-parenting app without drama. She was living in a smaller apartment in Pasadena. Her foundation work was reduced to a single advisory role with a nonprofit she'd been involved with before everything collapsed. It wasn't the life she designed for herself, but it was a functioning one. Troy Bancroft had acknowledged paternity of the baby, a girl, I'd been told in passing. Whether he and Natalie had any kind of arrangement beyond that, I genuinely didn't know and didn't seek to find out. The fish tank happened. Owen named his 3 fish after prehistoric marine reptiles: Plejo, Mossy, and Gary, the last of which he admitted was not historically accurate, but felt right. I told him Gary was an excellent name for a fish. He agreed. On a Sunday in November, about 9 months after the day everything broke open in that shower hall in Riverside, I was in my workshop annex with the garage door up, working on a commercial espresso machine someone had dropped off for a complete overhaul. Owen was in the backyard throwing a tennis ball against the fence with the rhythmic patience of a kid who can entertain himself for hours. The afternoon light was flat and warm. The neighborhood was quiet. He came to the garage doorway at some point, ball in hand, and watched me work for a minute. "Dad," he said, "is this what it's going to be like now?" I set down the wrench and looked at him. "More or less. What do you think?" He considered it with the seriousness the question deserved. Then he shrugged, bounced the ball once on the concrete floor, and said, "I like it." He went back to the yard. I picked up the wrench and went back to work. Some things you build from nothing. Some things you rebuild from what's left. Either way, the work is the same: steady hands, the right tools, and enough patience to see it through to the end.